So, another significant event in the creation of Narcotics Anonymous is on April 10th, 1939, Alcoholics Anonymous published the Big Book. So I've had many people in Narcotics Anonymous come up and ask me, why is that such a significant event for Narcotics Anonymous? Well, AA actually taught Narcotics Anonymous something here or showed the people who came after this a way to do it. The AA Big Book is a roadmap for recovery. That's exactly what it is. It's also the vehicle that was used to share that roadmap. So you no longer had to be in Akron, Ohio, talking one-on-one to another drunk, or in New York, talking one-on-one to another drunk. You could send this book to LA, and they could start a meeting there based on that vehicle and that roadmap of recovery right there. And that's how the message was spread. But one of the really things that Chris and I enjoy here is that particular book made its way to a man by the name of Dr. Tom. And this is another significant event in the history of NA. And Dr. Tom, let me tell you a little bit of history about him. He was a physician from Shelby, North Carolina. And he had been addicted to alcohol, but he ended up in Lexington, Kentucky after a 12-year addiction to morphine. Because, see, you didn't get into Lexington, Kentucky if you were an alcoholic. You had to be addicted to an opiate to get there. And so while there, somebody actually gave him, he arrived in 1939. The Big Book was published in April, somewhere we think in the summer of 39. He was actually loaned this Big Book. He read the Big Book, and he actually said, you know, I honestly think these principles will work for me. And so he goes back in the fall of 1939 to Shelby, and he actually starts the very first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in North Carolina, in the whole state, in the fall of 1939. So Dr. Tom had become a huge resource for the AA General Service Office, because whenever they received inquiries about drugs or substances other than alcohol, they'd say, well, you know, we've got somebody down here in Shelby who's got some experience with that. And we're going to listen to Bill W. tell you a little story about Dr. Tom. And I also want to let you know that this tape right here was recorded in 1947 in Memphis, and it's one of the first known recordings of Bill W. speaking. So this is a pretty rare and historical tape right here. But we're going to let Bill tell you about Dr. Tom.
And I think that you'll find some of his observations interesting.
Speaking of Southern hospitality, it reminds me of one of the greatest stories ever to come out of Alcoholics Anonymous. One day, our central office in New York received a letter from a man who was an inmate of the Lexington place for drug addicts. And he went on to tell us in the letter how he had been a physician, had gone on to alcohol, and then on to morphine. And that while there in the asylum, someone had written him about AA, and he had been reading this AA book of ours. And he said, of course I used to be an alcoholic, but now I'm an addict of some 12 years standing. But I do see hope for me in this philosophy of yours. And when I get out of here, I'm certainly going to try it. Well, subsequently, our office struck up a correspondence with him. Little by little, he began to describe the formation of an AA group in Shelby. And he turned out to be a delightful, soft-spoken little man, who I shall call Dr. Tom. I found that Tom was rather reluctant to talk about what he had done in Shelby. So there wasn't much AA shop talk at the table, practically unheard of elsewhere. And I wondered myself if dope had a humbling effect. If so, I think that some of us alcoholics should have taken more of it. But the crux of my story turned around what happened the following morning. Somebody called up from the lobby and said, "Do you mind, Bill? I'd like to drop up and tell you a few things about Dr. Tom." Do you realize that when that man came back here to this little town, can you possibly comprehend what the stigma was upon him? The stigma of both alcohol and morphine. People were so afraid that they hardly spoke to him on the street. And he said, "I am sorry to say that even the drunks of Shelby were snobbish, saying that they weren't going to be sobered up by no damn drug addict." Well, little by little he started to work, and little by little he began to succeed. Tom now has been made the head of our local hospital. He probably has the largest medical practice in this county today. All of this accomplished in 3 years from a start way behind the line. And we have a yearly custom in this town in which all of its citizens take a vote on which one of them has been the most useful individual to the community in the year past. And last spring, Dr. Tom was almost unanimously nominated as the most useful citizen of the town of Shelby.
The award that Bill was talking about was actually, in 1943, he was voted Lions Club Man of the Year. But the moral of the story that Bill was talking about that's very, very important is that you sober up, you work steps, you become an asset to society and to your community. Before that, you were pretty much a negative to your community and to your family. But in 3 short years, you can turn that around to where you're a very positive asset to your community. So Dr. Tom is the first known person to achieve sustained recovery from addiction to drugs other than alcohol through the 12 steps of AA. And he did that his whole life.
And so one of the questions that we posed in the beginning is, why was there the need for something besides Alcoholics Anonymous for addicts? If we saw that it worked in this case with this man who was an addict, why was there the need for something else? We're going to explore that in the upcoming slides.
So the next significant event in the history of Narcotics Anonymous is actually the publication of the AA Grapevine, and it started in June of '44. And the best way for me to describe the Grapevine of that time is basically it's the Facebook of today. It was how people in other parts of the United States knew what was going on in other parts of the fellowship, was through the Grapevine. It's where you could write in, talk about problems that you had, solutions, tell your story. It was just a wonderful vehicle, if you were, for the alcoholic himself to be able to communicate with other alcoholics. One of the things that we like about it is that it was actually the first conduit in which addicts in Alcoholics Anonymous could actually recognize that there were other addicts around. And we're going to read something here.
So in just the 3rd issue of the Grapevine in August of '44, it came out just 3 months after it first published, a Doc N submits a letter suggesting a Hopheads Corner, and I'll read it to you. He says, "Your 2nd issue at hand inspires me to an idea. I'm sure there are other AAs who, like myself, are finding in AA the highway to freedom from narcotics. Why not give us a Hopheads Corner in the Grapevine? After all, we do have a particular problem. Even if mine is essentially the same problem of all alcoholics, I occasionally wish that there were just one other narcotic victim in my AA group with whom I might share experiences. And though through the help of the higher power and my AA friends I no longer take morphine, I realize I fear it in a way I've ceased fearing alcohol. If I could just share experiences with some other hophead, I know it would be a big help. And among AA's thousands, I'm sure I'll find my fellows. Sincerely, Doc N. So we see that he's still struggling with the obsession around morphine, and he can't find the identification that's necessary. And in the very next issue, Dr. Tom responds in September of '44 to Doc N's request. And he says, "We have in our club 5 men who have had many years of drug addiction, but who are finding complete freedom from drugs and are well on the highway to successful and happy living. Their period of freedom varies from 5 months to 6 years, and they all attribute this to the help of a higher power that has come to them through AA." And he goes on to say, "I'm sure that other AA groups have men who are finding the new life of freedom, and I earnestly wish that we may get into communication with each other, and I suggest the possibility sometime of interesting the U.S. Public Health Service in the establishment of an AA group in their hospital in Lexington, Kentucky," from Doc M. So this is a gentleman by the name of Houston S. Houston gets sober in Alcoholics Anonymous in June of '44 in Montgomery, Alabama. He was certainly in Alcoholics Anonymous when the Grapevine was being published. We don't know if he read those Grapevine articles, but we do know that he met in his AA group in Alabama a man named Harry. And Harry had that dual problem of morphine and alcohol addiction. He spent 27 months in Lexington. Harry could stop drinking, but he couldn't stop using morphine. This made a big impact upon Houston. And in September of '46, Houston's job transfers him to Frankfort, Kentucky, which is near Lexington. And remembering his friend Harry, he decides to approach the medical director, Dr. Victor Vogel, and inquire about starting a 12-step group there for addicts. And this is very interesting for 2 reasons. One, it was somewhat unusual for alcoholics to go and work with addicts. And the second thing that's interesting about it is AA had not yet developed a service structure for institutional meetings. So there was no roadmap for Houston to follow to say, oh, this is a common thing to take meetings into jails, prisons, or hospitals. But because of Houston's vision and his desire to help people like his friend Harry, Dr. Vogel agrees, and the first 12-step fellowship for addicts is formed on February 16, 1947, and they call it Addicts Anonymous. And it's based only in the hospital in Lexington, and Houston serves as the group's sponsor. One of the things that's really important about this is that they published a newsletter, and the newsletter was called The Key, and it became a vehicle also that helped transmit this message that there was a way for addicts to find recovery. And we've been fortunate to track down about 21 of these issues of The Key, and one of them has a very rich history of Addicts Anonymous group. So Boyd's going to read kind of an excerpt from this, and this was written in 1963.
And it says here, the history of Addicts Anonymous. One snowy morning in mid-February 1947, 4 men drove miles across the state of Kentucky to Lexington, and God rode with them. They stopped at the gatehouse of the United States Public Health Hospital, and the guard permitted them to proceed the long, curvy driveway to the main building called Narco by the patients. That afternoon, a small group gathered with them in the chapel, and Addicts Anonymous was born. These 4 pioneers were members of Alcoholics Anonymous, Frankfort, Kentucky chapter. They were more than just pioneers. They were pilgrims and crusaders. They brought with them the most powerful of all curatives, hope and faith. And it says, at this time, February 1963, the Addicts Anonymous movement is 16 years old. It's difficult to estimate how many people have been helped through this program. However, the membership receives letters daily from people who are now free of drugs and give all the credit to the AA, Addicts Anonymous movement. At the beginning of our 17th year of organization, we are still fortunate to have our original sponsor with us. He has taken great pains with this program and has done good for the addict that cannot be weighed by any scales on this earth. He claims that he derives more benefit than he gives by helping others. You have the undying gratitude of hundreds of us that you have helped, and Addicts Anonymous thanks you from the bottom of their hearts, Mr. Houston S.
That's very nice. One of the things that Houston did was, again, there was no belief that addicts could find recovery. There was just emerging belief that alcoholics could, but there was no belief at this time that addicts could find recovery. And his continued involvement and commitment to this group conveyed a very direct message to the members of that group that he had belief and hope in them. And as people started finding recovery, it started providing hope not only for other addicts, but for society as a whole. And this is a picture of an Addicts Anonymous meeting in Lexington in 1950. And in their newsletter, The Key, they had something that was called Our Purpose. And we're drawing attention to it now because in our research we've discovered that this had an influence on Narcotics Anonymous that was formed in 1953. The Addicts Anonymous group starts corresponding with Alcoholics Anonymous General Headquarters, and in March of '49, Bobby B. Writes back to the secretary of the group, a guy named Clarence, and she says to Clarence, "We are mailing you a small complimentary package of literature. We do not have anything written for the drug addict who is looking to Alcoholics Anonymous to help him maintain his recovery. But you can, in reading our material, substitute the word drugs for alcohol." And in talking to people who have found recovery in Narcotics Anonymous prior to the publication of the basic text, this is a common story that they share of taking literature from Alcoholics Anonymous, changing the words to fit their drug of choice, and using it for their recovery. The Addicts Anonymous group said, if AA doesn't have any literature specifically for the drug addict, we'll create our own. And they borrowed a pamphlet that originated out of Birmingham, Alabama, called A Way of Life. And they took this format and they created something called Our Way of Life. And Our Way of Life is the first known publication of literature for addicts in a 12-step fellowship other than Alcoholics Anonymous. But it wasn't original material. It was modified from an existing source. I'm going to turn over to Boyd. Boyd's going to tell you about how this Addicts Anonymous message leaves Lexington and first travels to New York.